It is August 19th, 1991. Moscow is tense, electric, and alive with whispers of a coup. Tanks roll through the streets, their cold steel glinting in the summer sun. Citizens press against barricades, unsure whether to resist, flee, or wait for orders that may never come. A helicopter hovers above the Kremlin, broadcasting the images of a government in chaos. Inside, key leaders of a nation that once commanded the fate of half the world are locking themselves in meeting rooms, arguing, debating, trembling. The Soviet Union, the colossal empire built on ideology, ambition, and terror, is unraveling before their eyes. For 74 years, the hammer and sickle was more than a symbol. It was a promise, a threat, a religion. And now, in this sweltering August heat, it is being questioned, cracked, and ultimately abandoned. What caused this empire to rise from the ashes of Tsarist Russia, dominate half the globe, and then collapse under the weight of its own contradictions? The answer is not simple. It is a story of visionaries and tyrants, of revolutions won and promises broken, of ideological fervor clashing with human frailty. It is a story of power at every scale, from the Kremlin halls to the factories, from the collective farms to the secret police offices that whispered fear into every corner of life. And it begins, as all great upheavals do, with ambition, desperation, and a man who dared to dream of something impossibly new. Russia in the early 20th century was a land of extremes. A country where peasants tilled frozen soil for centuries, barely scraping by, while the Tsars and their nobles lived in gilded opulence. Moscow and St. Petersburg were booming, but the countryside was starving. Ideas of change had been simmering for decades, whispered in secret meetings, printed in underground pamphlets, spreading like wildfire among those who dared to hope for a new order. Among them was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Born in 1870 to a middle-class family, he witnessed the brutality of the state firsthand. His brother executed for plotting against the Tsarist regime, young Lenin was radicalized, but he was also a thinker, a strategist, someone who saw patterns where others saw chaos. He believed in the power of the masses, but he also understood the necessity of discipline, of secrecy, of uncompromising control. By 1917, Russia was in flames. The First World War had shredded the old order. Millions of soldiers were dying on the front lines, cities were in turmoil, and bread lines were growing by the day. In February, protests and strikes toppled the centuries-old Romanov dynasty. The country had a taste of freedom, but it was fragile, chaotic, unstructured. Into this vacuum stepped Lenin and his Bolsheviks. Lenin's genius was not just ideology, it was timing. He understood that revolutions are won not only with words, but with the audacity to act decisively. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power. The winter sky over Petrograd was cold and gray, the Neva River slushy with ice. Soldiers loyal to the old government faced factory workers armed with nothing but sheer conviction. It was chaotic, messy, violent, but it worked. The empire of the Tsars was gone, and in its place, a new world was imagined. This was not a gentle birth. Civil war erupted almost immediately, pitting the Red Army against the White forces, former imperial officers, and foreign interventionists. Cities burned. Millions died. Yet, through terror, organization, and an iron vision, Lenin and his comrades consolidated power. They understood that a revolution without control is just anarchy, and so they built not just a new government, but an entire system designed to enforce it. The 1920s and 1930s were an era of relentless experimentation and brutal pragmatism. Lenin's death in 1924 left a vacuum that would ignite one of history's most infamous power struggles. Joseph Stalin emerged, not the most charismatic, not the most visionary, but the most cunning, ruthless, and unrelenting. He consolidated power through alliances, betrayals, and purges, removing rivals with a precision that shocked even hardened political observers. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union transformed at a dizzying pace. The countryside, long a bastion of tradition and resistance, was subjected to forced collectivization. Millions were uprooted, starved, or executed. Famously in Ukraine's Holodomor, but but the Soviet state grew stronger, more centralized. Cities expanded with factories, railways, and canals. Heavy industry became the heartbeat of a nation that was determined to challenge the world. The five-year plans were more than economic programs. They were a testament to ambition bordering on obsession. Magnificent in scope, terrifying in execution, they transformed the Soviet Union from a backward agrarian state into a global industrial power. Workers toiled for endless hours under brutal conditions, but the state rewarded loyalty with housing, education, and a sense of belonging to something historic. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union was a paradox, a land of terror and opportunity, of secret police and soaring achievements. The Red Army was modernized. Science and technology were pushed to new heights. Moscow's skyline transformed with monumental architecture that proclaimed, "We are here, and we will endure." Yet the cost of this ascent was human suffering that is almost impossible to comprehend, a dark undercurrent that would echo throughout Soviet history. But as Stalin's shadow loomed over the nation, the world beyond its borders was preparing to test the Soviet experiment. Dictators rose across Europe. The fire of war was gathering. Would the Soviet Union survive the storm, or would its internal contradictions doom it before it could even prove its strength? By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union had become a titan of industrial and military might, but it was still a house of cards in some ways. Stalin ruled with an iron fist, yet he had managed to forge a nation capable of projecting power across Eurasia. Monumental buildings rose in Moscow. Factories spewed steel and smoke, forming a skyline that seemed to defy both gravity and history. Science, engineering, and education flourished within strict boundaries, and the Soviet citizen, for all the terror, felt a peculiar mixture of fear, pride, and belonging. Then came the storm, 1941. Hitler's Wehrmacht, confident, brutal, and seemingly unstoppable, invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. The speed and ferocity of the German advance were staggering. Cities fell, millions of lives were lost, and the Red Army initially faltered under the weight of surprise and unpreparedness. Stalin himself retreated into isolation, even considering fleeing Moscow. But the Soviet system, terrifying in its efficiency and resilience, began to fight back. Ordinary people became legends overnight. Factory workers left their machines to dig trenches. Farmers joined partisan groups to ambush supply lines, and young soldiers fought in cities reduced to rubble. At Stalingrad, a name that would echo through history, the tide began to turn. The battle was not just a clash of armies. It was a crucible of human will, strategy, and sheer endurance. Street by street, building by building, Soviet soldiers and civilians repelled the Germans, transforming despair into defiance. By 1945, the Soviet Union had emerged from the war as both victor and victim. Cities were decimated, tens of millions dead, and yet, the nation stood, larger, stronger, and feared by the world. Moscow and Leningrad became symbols of survival and resilience. Stalin, now the undisputed master, positioned the Soviet Union as a superpower poised to shape global affairs for decades. The post-war years were a period of astonishing transformation. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet influence, as Red Army boots and political maneuvering turned occupied territories into satellite states. Warsaw, Budapest, Prague, and Berlin were no longer just battlefields. They were chess pieces in a game that would define the Cold War. Domestically, the Soviet Union rebuilt at a staggering pace. Cities that had been bombed into dust were reconstructed with brutalist precision. The five-year plans returned, this time with a focus on consumer goods, scientific advancement, and military technology. The space race began, an audacious venture into the heavens, designed to prove ideological superiority on a cosmic scale. By 1957, the launch of Sputnik sent shockwaves across the world. Humanity had left its cradle, and the Soviet Union claimed credit. This era was the Soviet Union at its zenith, culturally, technologically, and militarily. Literature, art, and music were heavily controlled but prolific, producing works that inspired citizens and projected power abroad. Soviet architecture, with its monumental scale and symmetry, reinforced the narrative of unassailable might. Even everyday life, constrained by quotas and propaganda, carried the rhythm of a nation convinced of its historical destiny. Yet, beneath this veneer of achievement, tensions simmered. The same authoritarian control that enabled rapid industrialization also stifled innovation outside state-approved channels. The secret police, ever present, ensured obedience but created fear, paranoia, and suppressed the very human curiosity that drives progress. These contradictions, efficiency versus oppression, pride versus fear, would eventually shape the cracks in the Soviet edifice. The seeds of decline were subtle at first but pervasive. After Stalin's death in 1953, a new leadership emerged under Nikita Khrushchev. His famous secret speech in 1956 denounced Stalin's cult of personality, shocking a nation conditioned to obedience. Khrushchev's reforms, including de-Stalinization and limited liberalization, aimed to modernize the Soviet system but instead exposed deep structural weaknesses. Economic stagnation began to bite. Centralized planning, once a tool of rapid development, now became rigid and inefficient. Factories produced in quantity but not quality. Agriculture lagged, and the collective farm system, never fully efficient, faltered under bureaucratic mismanagement. Citizens noticed shortages, and resentment grew quietly behind closed doors. Politically, the Soviet Union faced challenges on multiple fronts. The Cold War consumed resources and attention, creating a military-industrial complex that prioritized weapons over well-being. Proxy wars, from Vietnam to Afghanistan, strained finances and morale. International prestige often masked domestic decay. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union's diverse population was increasingly difficult to manage. Over 100 nationalities, cultures, and languages were bound together by ideology, coercion, and propaganda. In the Baltic states, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, local resentment simmered, occasionally erupting into protests, but often suppressed swiftly. The tension between unity and autonomy created cracks that would widen over decades. Leadership failures compounded systemic problems. Leonid Brezhnev's tenure, 1964 to 1982, is remembered for relative stability, but beneath the surface lay stagnation, corruption, and complacency. The Politburo became increasingly insulated, decision-making slow, and innovation rare. Citizens, while indoctrinated with loyalty, began to notice the mismatch between propaganda and reality. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union faced pressures it could neither ignore nor easily suppress. An economy strained beyond repair, leadership struggling to reform, and a population increasingly aware of the freedoms enjoyed by the world beyond the Iron Curtain. Yet, in 1985, a new figure stepped into power, Mikhail Gorbachev, whose policies of openness and restructuring would set the stage for a transformation the world would barely recognize before it was too late. When Mikhail Gorbachev assumed leadership in 1985, he faced a nation on life support. The Soviet economy was a labyrinth of inefficiencies, technological backwardness, and rigid bureaucracy. Factories still produced goods in massive quantities, but quality was poor. Farms struggled to meet quotas. Citizens queued for hours for food, clothing, and basic necessities. Gorbachev introduced Perestroika, a bold economic restructuring aimed at injecting efficiency and flexibility into the system. Managers were given some autonomy, small private enterprises were allowed, and innovation was encouraged, but only partially. The system had been frozen for decades. Sudden thawing created confusion, resistance, and unintended consequences. At the same time, Glasnost, political openness, unleashed forces that the regime could no longer contain. Newspapers published stories of corruption, famine, and historical atrocities previously buried under decades of censorship. Television broadcast debates that questioned Soviet orthodoxy. Ordinary citizens, previously silenced by fear, began to speak, write, and organize. Nationalist movements gained traction in the Baltic states, the Caucasus, and Ukraine. Ironically, Gorbachev's reforms, intended to save the system, hastened its unraveling. By loosening control over speech and economy, he revealed decades of systemic rot. Citizens realized the Soviet Union was not invincible, and elites began jockeying for power and autonomy. The state's image of unassailable strength cracked, and the empire's vast, diverse territories began to imagine a future without Moscow's control. By 1990, the Soviet Union was teetering. Boris Yeltsin, rising from Moscow politics, became the public face of opposition. Economic stagnation, political paralysis, and nationalist unrest converged into a perfect storm. On August 19, 1991, hardline communist officials attempted a coup, declaring Gorbachev unfit to rule. Tanks rolled through Moscow streets, radios crackled with confusion, and citizens, many disillusioned, many hopeful, took to the barricades. Yet, the coup failed. Not because the conspirators were weak, but because the people, tired of decades of repression, refused to obey blindly. The images of ordinary Muscovites confronting armored columns became symbols of a nation no longer willing to be dictated to. Within days, Gorbachev returned, but the damage was irreversible. By December 1991, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. The hammer and sickle were lowered for the last time in the Kremlin. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and 15 other republics declared independence. What had once seemed eternal, the most formidable empire of the 20th century, vanished almost overnight, leaving behind a mixture of nostalgia, regret, relief, and uncertainty. The Soviet Union's legacy is vast, contradictory, and enduring. On one hand, it demonstrated the capacity of a centralized system to industrialize a backward nation, defeat one of history's most aggressive militaries, and project power across the globe. Its space achievements, scientific advancements, and cultural contributions remain celebrated worldwide. On the other hand, it was a cautionary tale. An empire built on coercion, secrecy, and ideological rigidity will eventually fracture under its contradictions. Its collapse unleashed economic turmoil, political instability, and identity crises in successor states. Millions struggled to adapt to the sudden freedoms and uncertainties of the post-Soviet world. What if history had unfolded differently? What if Stalin's purges had been less brutal, or if Khrushchev's reforms had succeeded? Could the Soviet Union have survived the Cold War intact, perhaps evolving into a hybrid system of socialism and market reforms decades earlier? Or, conversely, had the USSR fallen sooner, could the world have avoided nuclear brinkmanship in the 1960s? These questions linger, sparking endless debate among historians and laypeople alike. Even today, the shadow of the Soviet Union stretches across global politics. NATO exists because of the perceived Soviet threat. Eastern European borders, economies, and political cultures are shaped by decades of Soviet control. Russia's modern political posture, its emphasis on centralized authority, and its global ambitions are deeply informed by the Soviet experience. Culturally, the USSR's achievements in space, sports, literature, and cinema continue to inspire. Citizens of former Soviet states navigate a dual identity, pride in accomplishments, trauma from oppression, and a continuous negotiation with history. For the world, the Soviet Union remains a symbol of both possibility and peril, how quickly dreams of progress can be entwined with terror, and how power, no matter how immense, is always fragile. Throughout its rise and fall, the story of the Soviet Union is a story of human ambition, fear, and contradiction. Lenin's idealism collided with reality. Stalin's vision was inseparable from terror. Gorbachev's hope for reform triggered dissolution. Ordinary citizens, too, were protagonists in this drama. Soldiers, farmers, factory workers, and intellectuals all shaping history, often unknowingly. The empire fell not in a single decisive battle, but through a convergence of factors, systemic inefficiencies, leadership miscalculations, social unrest, and the irresistible desire of people to shape their own destinies. It is a cautionary tale, yes, but also a story of resilience, creativity, and the human spirit, because even as the Soviet Union collapsed, its people survived, adapted, and reshaped the world. What do you think was the single most critical factor in the Soviet Union's collapse? Leadership, ideology, or economic inefficiency? Could a different leader, a different policy, or even a single pivotal decision have saved it? Comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more cinematic, character-driven history documentaries. Share this video with someone fascinated by empires, revolutions, and the forces that shape our world. History is not just about dates and events. It's about human choices, ambitions, and mistakes. The rise and fall of the Soviet Union is proof that even the mightiest empires are ultimately defined by the people who build, sustain, and challenge them.